Welcome to my channel. Welcome to that channel.
The Secret Grave on the Moor Vertical Bar, a Hamish Macbeth mystery. The morning mist lay over Loch Dhu, like an elderly aunt refusing to leave after Christmas. It softened the outlines of the white cottages, wrapped itself around the fishing boats in the harbour, and crept lazily up the heather-covered slopes until the hills themselves seemed half-imagined. A damp breeze carried the scent of peat smoke, wet earth, and the salt tang of the sea. It was, Hamish Macbeth reflected with satisfaction, weather designed specifically to discourage unnecessary activity. He leaned comfortably against the stone wall beside the police station, one long leg crossed over the other, nursing an enamel mug of strong coffee. His faithful dog Lugs lay sprawled across the doorstep, with all the solemn dignity of a creature who had never once considered chasing anything unless it looked particularly slow. The police station telephone began ringing. Hamish looked thoughtfully at it through the open window. It continued ringing. "Aye," he said to Lugs. "If it's important, they'll ring again." Lugs opened one eye, judged the matter beneath his concern, and closed it once more. The telephone eventually fell silent. Peace settled over Loch Dhu again. Hamish took another mouthful of coffee. There were moments when he felt the Highlands had achieved perfection. Not the sort of perfection admired by tourists with expensive cameras and guidebooks, but the quieter sort that came from leaving well enough alone. The gulls complained overhead. Somewhere a sheep expressed dissatisfaction with life. A fishing boat chugged steadily out toward deeper water. Perfect. His tranquility lasted precisely 4 minutes. The postmistress, Angela Brodie, marched across the square carrying a canvas sack bulging with letters. "You've not answered your telephone again," she called. Hamish gave her his friendliest smile. "Must have been out. You were standing exactly where you are now." "I must have stepped away." She looked around the completely empty square. "Where?" Hamish considered. Briefly, Angela snorted. "You'll be the death of Superintendent Daviot one day." "I've no wish to hurry the man." She laughed despite herself. Everyone in Loch Dhu knew Hamish's methods. Outsiders imagined he did nothing all day except drink coffee, gossip with old women, and wander about with his dog. The villagers knew better. Well, not entirely better. Even they sometimes wondered how he managed to solve crimes while appearing permanently half asleep. Angela sorted through her letters. "There's excitement coming." "There usually is when you say that." "A wealthy Englishman." Hamish sighed quietly. "Another one?" "So they say. Bought the old Moor house." "Moor house?" "The place above the western moor. I know where it is. It was sold for an astonishing amount. Everything is." Angela lowered her voice. "They say he's planning to turn the whole estate into a luxury retreat." Hamish frowned slightly. That would not go down well. The western moor belonged to no one in particular, or rather, everyone believed it belonged a little bit to everyone. Shepherds crossed it without asking permission. Children wandered there in summer. Fishermen cut across it on old footpaths, older than memory itself. New owners often failed to understand such things, especially English ones. Angela continued. "He's bringing in surveyors. Oh dear. And fencing. Oh dear. And apparently helicopters." Hamish took another careful sip of coffee. "That's very bad. You don't sound upset." "I am. You don't look it." "I never do." Angela smiled knowingly. "You'll be keeping an eye on him. If he behaves himself, I shall ignore him. And if he doesn't?" Hamish looked toward the distant hills disappearing into cloud. "I likely have more paperwork than I want." By lunchtime the gossip had grown like mushrooms after rain. At the Loch Dhu Hotel, Mrs. McLean set bowls of steaming Cullen skink before a collection of villagers who discussed the newcomer with mounting enthusiasm. "He made his money in London," announced the schoolmaster. "In property," said the minister. "In lawsuits," corrected someone else. "I heard investments. I heard politics. I heard 3 wives. I heard 4. Hamish sat quietly near the fire, eating slowly. Nobody noticed he rarely contributed. They merely talked around him. It was remarkable what people revealed when they believed a policeman wasn't listening. Mrs. McLean appeared with fresh bread. "You'll want another bowl, Hamish." "I could be persuaded." "You always can." She smiled fondly. "You'll need strength once yon English fellow arrives." Hamish accepted the refill gratefully. Good soup deserved appreciation. Across the room, Rory McGregor leaned forward dramatically. "My cousin in Inverness says the fellow owns paintings worth millions." Someone whistled. Another shook his head. "What sort of fool keeps paintings in the Highlands?" "The rich sort." There was general agreement. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, the fire crackled. Hamish felt entirely content, which was precisely when fate decided to interfere. The newcomer arrived shortly after 3 o'clock. His vehicle entered Lochdu like a battleship invading a fishing harbour. It was enormous, black, spotless despite the muddy roads. Children stopped playing football. Old ladies paused in conversation. Even the gulls appeared mildly offended. The vehicle rolled slowly through the village before stopping directly outside the hotel. A tall man emerged. He wore an expensive waterproof coat that looked as though it had never encountered actual rain. Silver hair, perfect posture, polished boots wholly unsuitable for Highland mud. He surveyed Lochdu with the expression of a man inspecting a hotel room that had failed to meet expectations. Hamish watched from across the square. The stranger noticed him immediately. "You." Hamish glanced behind himself. The man frowned. "Yes, you." Hamish ambled over. "Afternoon. I'm looking for the police." "You found him." The stranger blinked. "You? So I've been told. I expected." He hesitated. "A uniform? A proper policeman?" Hamish smiled pleasantly. "I've one of those as well." The Englishman studied him. The lanky red-haired constable looked untidy enough to be mistaken for a shepherd. His waterproof jacket had seen years of service. His boots carried traces of peat. His cap sat slightly crooked. Entirely unimpressive. "Excellent. I am Alistair Pembroke." Hamish nodded politely. "Pleased to meet you. I've purchased Muir House. So I've heard. I intend considerable improvements. I'm sure I shall require local cooperation. That would be helpful." Pembroke looked faintly irritated. "I don't think you understand. I often don't. I've already encountered resistance. You've been here 4 minutes. Exactly." Hamish waited. Silence had an interesting effect on people. Many rushed to fill it. Pembroke proved no exception. "Your villagers appear incapable of following simple instructions. They're not my villagers. They're blocking access roads. They probably have reasons. My contractors have legal authority. I expect the police to enforce it." Hamish scratched lugs behind the ears. "I'll have a word if necessary. I'd rather you removed them. We'll see." Pembroke's mouth tightened. "I was warned Highland policing was relaxed. So it is. I dislike inefficiency." Hamish's face remained perfectly blank. "That's unfortunate." Pembroke gave him one long dismissive look. Then he turned sharply and strode into the hotel without another word. Mrs. McLean watched him enter. Her smile vanished before he reached the reception desk. Within moments, raised voices floated into the square. "He'll not last a fortnight," Angela observed quietly from beside the post office. Hamish considered the hotel entrance. "No. You agree? He'll either leave, or—" Hamish looked toward the distant western moor, where thick grey clouds had begun swallowing the hills. "Or he'll make someone very angry." The wind freshened. Somewhere beyond the village, hidden beneath drifting mist and endless stretches of purple heather, the lonely moor waited in silence. It had kept secrets for generations. Before another week had passed, it would surrender one more. Hamish lingered outside the hotel for a minute or two after Pembroke had disappeared indoors. There was no profit in following a man the instant he arrived. People, especially the self-important sort, revealed more when they believed no one cared enough to watch them. Lugs sneezed at the wind. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "Let's give him enough rope." The dog thumped his tail in agreement, or perhaps at the prospect of supper. By evening, the drizzle had become steady Highland rain, the sort that did not fall so much as seep into every stone, fence, and woolen sleeve. Lochdu retreated indoors. Lamps glowed warmly behind curtained windows, peat fires crackled, and the harbour disappeared into a veil of mist. Hamish occupied his favourite corner of the Lochdu hotel dining room, with a plate of stew and another mug of coffee. Mrs. McLean came bustling over. "He's already complaining." "I expected as much. He says the soup is too thick." Hamish looked thoughtfully into his own bowl. "It is." She stared at him. "It ought to stand a spoon upright." "It nearly does." "Exactly." Hamish nodded solemnly. "Then it's perfect." She chuckled before lowering her voice. "He's asked whether we can arrange valet parking." Hamish nearly choked on a piece of potato. "For where?" I asked him the same. "There are only 3 places to leave a car, and all 3 are muddy. He'll have to make peace with mud." McLean sighed. "I don't think he's made peace with anything." At the far side of the dining room, Pembroke sat alone beneath a framed photograph of the harbour taken decades earlier. His expensive luggage had been stacked neatly beside the staircase. A laptop case rested against his chair, though he scarcely looked at it. Instead, he studied the room with thinly disguised irritation. as though every conversation occurring around him was a personal inconvenience. The villagers pretended not to notice him. That required considerable effort. Eventually Pembroke beckoned Hamish with one finger. Mrs. McLean rolled her eyes. "Go on. I was hoping you wouldn't say that. You are the police. Unfortunately." Hamish wandered over with the slow, easy stride of a man in no particular hurry. Pembroke folded his napkin with excessive precision. "I've encountered another problem." "So soon? My surveyors. What about them?" "They've refused to begin work." Hamish waited. "They claim local people are threatening them." "Did they say who?" "No names." "What sort of threats?" Pembroke's expression suggested he found the entire subject beneath him. "Someone painted 'Go Home' on one of their vehicles." Hamish rubbed his chin. "In English?" Pembroke frowned. "Of course. That's considerate. I fail to see the humor." "So do I. They've also found dead rabbits hanging from fence posts." Hamish's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That sounds theatrical." "It's intimidation." "Perhaps. I want arrests. For dead rabbits. For whoever is responsible." Hamish leaned comfortably against the back of a chair. "I'll ask around. I expect more than that." "You'll likely receive more than that." "When?" "When people have something to tell me." Pembroke's patience visibly frayed. "You have an infuriating habit of speaking in riddles." No. I just answer slowly." Pembroke dismissed him with an impatient wave. Hamish returned to his stew. Mrs. McLean placed an extra slice of bread beside him without a word. "He's making friends," Hamish observed. "Like a fox in a henhouse." The following morning dawned unexpectedly bright. The rain had washed the air clean. Sunlight glittered across the loch, while low clouds drifted lazily between the mountains. Hamish had every intention of spending an hour checking sheep on the northern road before quietly forgetting about paperwork. Instead, he found old Donald McLean waiting outside the police station. Donald leaned heavily on his stick. "Morning, Hamish." "Morning. You'll be hearing things." "I usually do." Donald glanced around before lowering his voice. "About the moor." Hamish became attentive without appearing to. "What about it?" "Pembroke's men have been digging. For foundations?" "So they claim." Donald spat thoughtfully onto the road. "They're not digging where sensible folk would build." "No? They're digging the old ridge." Hamish looked toward the western hills. "There isn't much there." Donald gave him a peculiar look. "There is if you're old enough." Hamish waited. The silence stretched comfortably. Finally Donald spoke. "My grandfather used to say nobody should disturb that ground." "Why?" "He never explained." "Did you ask?" "He said some stories were healthier left buried." Donald shifted uneasily. People laughed at him. "And you?" "I laughed too." "What changed?" The look on his face. Donald was not a fanciful man. He had spent 70 years raising sheep and speaking only when words served a purpose. Hamish filed the conversation carefully away. "Who else remembers this?" "Not many." "Anyone younger?" Donald shook his head. "The old ones are dying." Hamish nodded slowly. "Thank you." Donald hesitated. "You'll keep an eye on things." "I always do." Around midday, Hamish wandered westward with lugs padding faithfully at his heels. The track climbed steadily out of Loch Dhu until the village became a scattering of white cottages below. The wind strengthened. Heather rippled in long purple waves across the hills. The silence out here differed from village silence. It was older, the kind that made a man's footsteps seem unnecessarily loud. Muir House stood alone on its rise, a grey stone building overlooking miles of empty moorland. Builders' vans and expensive four-wheel drives clustered outside like beetles. Pembroke's surveyors worked farther uphill. One of them noticed Hamish approaching. "You the local policeman?" "So they tell me." The younger man looked relieved. "I'm Simon." "Hamish, I'm glad you're here." "Why?" Simon glanced over his shoulder before speaking quietly. "The others won't admit it." "Admit what?" "They don't like working up there." Hamish followed his gaze. The excavation lay perhaps 100 yards away, where the heather had been stripped back to expose dark peat. "Something wrong with the ground." Simon hesitated. "You'll laugh." "I often do. We keep finding things." "What sort of things?" "Old buttons." "Common enough." "Horseshoes." "Also common." Simon swallowed. "Bones." Hamish's expression remained unchanged. "Animal." "We thought so. And now?" "The foreman says they look human." A gust of wind swept across the moor. Lugs stopped walking. The dog's ears stood upright. He stared toward the excavation, without barking, without moving. Hamish noticed. Lugs almost never hesitated. The surveyor shifted uneasily. "We told Mr. Pembroke." "What did he say?" He ordered us to keep digging. Hamish looked toward the ridge. Several workers stood gathered in a loose circle. Nobody was using a shovel. Nobody was talking. That alone was unusual. As Hamish and Luggs approached, the foreman climbed slowly out of a narrow trench. His face had turned the color of old paper. "You'd better have a look, Constable." Hamish stepped to the edge. Freshly cut peat formed black walls nearly 4 feet deep. At the bottom lay a skeleton, not neatly buried in a coffin, not resting in consecrated ground. The bones sprawled awkwardly, one arm twisted beneath the ribs, as though whoever had been placed there had never been intended to receive a proper burial. Near the skull lay the rusted remains of an old silver brooch. The peat had preserved scraps of dark cloth clinging stubbornly to the bones despite the passing years. Pembroke arrived behind Hamish, annoyance already in his voice. "What is all this delay now?" Then he looked into the trench. His irritation vanished. For the first time since arriving in Lockdow, genuine uncertainty crossed his face. Hamish climbed carefully into the excavation, crouched beside the skeleton, and studied the silent witness the Moor had guarded for decades. Something caught his eye. The left wrist was still encircled by the corroded remains of a chain, not jewelry, a restraint. Someone had wanted to make very sure that whoever lay beneath the peat would never walk away. And, standing at the edge of the trench, Luggs gave a low, uneasy growl toward the empty stretch of moor beyond, as if sensing that the lonely grave had not finished giving up its secrets. The discovery spread through Lockdow faster than rain across a window pane. By the time Hamish and Luggs had walked back from the western moor, every cottage seemed to have someone standing at the gate, pretending to sweep a path, or hang washing while keeping one eye on the road. In a village the size of Lockdow, news never travelled alone. It gathered speculation as it went. Mrs. Wellington was firmly convinced the skeleton belonged to a Jacobite rebel. The minister believed it might be an unfortunate traveller lost in a winter storm. Old Angus Fraser declared with great confidence that everyone was wrong because no one had found a skeleton wearing Wellington boots in the 18th century. Nobody mentioned murder aloud. Not yet. Hamish left the gossip to grow by itself. Gossip, he had often found, was like bread dough. Poke it too much, and it collapsed. Leave it alone, and it rose nicely. He had scarcely hung his dripping jacket inside the police station when the telephone rang. This time he answered. Lockdow Police. The voice that exploded down the line belonged unmistakably to Detective Chief Inspector Blair. "Macbeth, good afternoon, sir. What in God's name have you managed to do now?" "I found some bones." "You what?" "They were already there." Blair ignored the remark. "I've had archaeologists, newspapers, and headquarters phoning me all afternoon. Why wasn't I informed immediately?" "I was walking back. You could have used the telephone. There isn't one on the moor." There was a dangerous silence. Hamish imagined Blair turning an alarming shade of crimson. "You stay exactly where you are. I'm coming." "I generally do." The receiver slammed down. Luggs lifted his head from beside the stove. "That'll be Blair," Hamish observed. The dog sighed deeply, as though he too had experience of the detective chief inspector. By early evening, 3 Strathbane police cars swept into Lockdow, with enough speed and noise to scatter gulls from the harbour. Villagers emerged onto doorsteps. Children counted the vehicles. Mrs. McLean folded her arms outside the hotel. "A circus has arrived." Hamish watched calmly as Blair climbed out of the lead car. The detective chief inspector was broad, red-faced, and already breathing heavily with indignation. Rain had begun falling again, plastering his thinning hair across his forehead. He marched straight toward Hamish. "You idle Highland idiot." "Evening, sir." Blair jabbed a finger into Hamish's chest. "I leave you alone for 5 minutes and you've turned my district into an archaeological dig. I don't believe I buried the skeleton." "Don't be clever. I wasn't trying. You never are." Several villagers had gathered nearby, pretending to admire the weather. Blair noticed them. "What are you all staring at?" Nobody answered. The villagers had perfected the art of becoming invisible whenever Blair shouted. He spun back toward Hamish. "Take me there." The journey across the moor was unpleasant. Wind whipped rain sideways, reducing visibility to little more than a few hundred yards. The builders had erected temporary floodlights around the excavation, their harsh beams cutting through the mist. Forensic officers had not yet arrived. The skeleton remained exactly where Hamish had left it. Blair climbed stiffly into the trench. He crouched beside the bones for perhaps 20 seconds, then he climbed out again. "Old. Aye. Very old. It would appear so. Nothing to do with us." Hamish looked down again. "Perhaps." Blair brushed mud from his trousers. "No perhaps about it. Ancient history." Pembroke stepped forward eagerly. I'm relieved to hear that. Blair nodded. Construction can resume once the archaeologists are finished. Hamish's eyes remained on the skeleton. Something continued to trouble him. The chain. The awkward position, the disturbed peat around the edge of the grave. He climbed back down into the trench, ignoring Blair's irritated sigh. He examined the soil more carefully. Peat preserved almost everything. That was why old bodies were sometimes found remarkably intact. But something here didn't fit. He reached out carefully and brushed loose earth away from the skeleton's left side. A small object emerged. Metal. Not ancient bronze. Not rusted iron. Something brighter. Hamish lifted it carefully between finger and thumb. It was a brass cartridge case. Blair laughed loudly. There you are. Hamish looked up. One of the workmen dropped it. Possibly. It proves nothing. No. But Hamish slipped the cartridge carefully into an evidence bag. Modern brass did not belong beneath centuries of compressed peat. Someone had disturbed this grave. Recently. Very recently. Later that night, after Blair had returned to the hotel in search of whiskey and a hot meal, Hamish walked alone through the quiet village. Rain drummed softly on slate roofs. A single lamp glowed in the post office. The harbour lay black beneath drifting fog. Lugs padded silently beside him until they reached Donald McLean's cottage. The old shepherd opened the door before Hamish knocked. I thought you'd come. So did I. Donald poured 2 mugs of strong tea. Neither man spoke for a while. Finally, Hamish asked quietly, who knew about that ridge? Donald stared into the fire. Very few. Names? There was old Shumus Campbell. He died. Aye. Who else? Donald hesitated. My grandfather. And? He used to mention another family. What family? The McKinnons. Hamish frowned. The Crofters? Donald nodded slowly. They lived on the edge of the moor before the Great War. I don't remember any McKinnons. There aren't any left. What happened? Donald looked uncomfortable. They disappeared. Hamish raised an eyebrow. Disappeared. Packed up overnight, according to most folk. And according to you. Donald leaned closer. My grandfather always said they didn't leave. The fire crackled loudly between them. He said they were simply never seen again. Hamish felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. How many? A whole family. Donald looked toward the dark window. 5 of them. Hamish finished his tea in silence. 5 missing villagers, a forgotten grave, a skeleton wearing a restraint, and someone, only days before Pembroke's excavation, had apparently dug into the same patch of peat. As he stepped back into the cold Highland night, the wind carried the mournful cry of a curlew across the empty moor. For the first time since finding the skeleton, Hamish became convinced of one thing. The grave had not been uncovered by accident. Someone had known exactly where it was, and they had returned before Pembroke's workmen ever put a shovel into the ground. The rain eased before dawn, leaving the highlands washed clean beneath a pale grey sky. Thin wisps of mist drifted over the moor, clinging stubbornly to the hollows before lifting toward the mountains. From his kitchen window, Hamish watched the weather with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed clouds were usually more interesting than people. His kettle whistled. Lugs sat patiently beside the stove, eyes fixed upon a frying pan containing 2 slices of bacon. You've no shame, Hamish observed. Lugs wagged his tail. I suppose neither have I. By the time the coffee was ready, there came a violent pounding on the police station door. Not a knock, a siege. Hamish opened it to find Detective Chief Inspector Blair standing there, soaked despite his expensive waterproof coat. You've been hiding. I've been making breakfast. Blair pushed past him without invitation. You'll eat later. I generally prefer before. You'll do as you're told. Lugs growled softly. Blair glanced uneasily at the dog. Control that beast. He usually controls himself. Blair ignored the remark and threw a folded newspaper onto the table. Across the front page, in bold type, ran the headline, Ancient Secret Found on Highland Moor. Below, it was a blurred photograph of Pembroke standing beside the excavation with an expression suggesting he regretted buying Scotland altogether. Blair jabbed the article with one thick finger. This is your fault. I don't remember inviting the newspaper. You should have secured the scene. I did. Then how did they get photographs? Hamish considered the question. They probably used a camera. Blair's face darkened alarmingly. I swear, Macbeth, one day you'll try the patience of a saint. I've been told they're difficult to annoy. Blair muttered something impolite under his breath. The forensic team arrived during the night, and they've recovered only 1 skeleton. Hamish nodded. I expected that. No signs of recent burial. I didn't expect one. The cartridge case is clean. Meaning? It hasn't been underground long. Hamish said nothing. Blair folded his arms triumphantly. So some idiot workman dropped it. Perhaps. There you are. But, Blair glared. What now? The brass wasn't muddy. So, the peat beneath it was. For the first time that morning, Blair hesitated. Hamish continued quietly. Someone placed it there after disturbing the soil. Blair snorted. Rubbish. Maybe. You and your village fairy tales. I'm only wondering. I don't pay you to wonder. No. I pay you to obey orders. Hamish wisely decided not to point out who actually paid him. By mid-morning, archaeologists had arrived from Inverness. Unlike Blair, they approached the grave with patience. Dr. Fiona McRae, a woman in her 40s, with practical boots and an expression of permanent curiosity, spent nearly an hour studying the trench before speaking. Hamish stood nearby, hands in his pockets. What do you think? He asked. She brushed peat carefully from one of the bones. This isn't an ordinary burial. I thought not. The wrists were restrained. I noticed. The body wasn't laid to rest. No, it was dumped. Hamish looked across the rolling moor. How old? Hard to say until we examine everything properly. A century? Older? Much? Perhaps considerably. She paused. But there's something stranger. Hamish waited. The skeleton suffered a fracture to the skull. Before death? Almost certainly. Murder? She smiled faintly. I leave that word to policemen. She carefully lifted the rusted brooch lying beside the ribs. This is unusual. Why? It doesn't belong with the clothing. Hamish frowned. You mean it wasn't worn? It appears to have been placed beside the body, as if someone left it intentionally. Exactly. She slipped it into a padded evidence box. A keepsake, perhaps. Or guilt. Hamish nodded thoughtfully. Meanwhile, Pembroke was becoming increasingly impatient. He cornered Blair beside the excavation. This delay is costing me thousands. Blair puffed out his chest. We're handling it. I have contractors sitting idle. Complain to Edinburgh. I intend to. Blair stiffened. You threatening me? I'm threatening everyone. Hamish happened to be passing. Pembroke pointed at him. Your constable spends more time staring at hills than doing police work. Blair barked a laugh. For once we agree. Hamish smiled pleasantly. I find hills relaxing. Pembroke shook his head in disbelief. Does nothing concern you? Oh, quite a lot. You hide it well. I've had practice. Pembroke turned away in disgust. Dr. McRae watched the exchange with interest. When Pembroke had gone, she asked quietly, Is he always like that? He seems to be improving. She laughed. I can't tell whether you're joking. Neither can I. That afternoon, Hamish visited the village archives, a small room behind the church where old parish records, maps, and yellowing documents gathered dust. The caretaker, Mrs. Jessie Grant, looked delighted to have company. I've put the kettle on. I thought you might. She poured tea into thick china cups. What are you hunting? Old maps. Which period? As old as you've got. She disappeared among shelves and returned carrying a leather-bound volume that smelled faintly of mildew. Hamish spread a faded map across the table. The western moor looked much as it did today. But one detail caught his attention. A tiny marking, barely visible. He leaned closer. What does that say? Jessie adjusted her spectacles. Kayak Hollow. I've never heard anyone call it that. They stopped years ago. Why? She shrugged. Old names disappear. Hamish traced the map with one finger. The marked hollow lay almost exactly where Pembroke's surveyors had uncovered the skeleton. What does the name mean? The old woman's hollow. Witch? Perhaps. Jessie smiled. Or simply an old widow. Highland place names often carried stories that outlived the people who first spoke them. Hamish copied the location into his notebook. Then another document slipped unexpectedly from between the pages. A folded sheet. Much newer than the map. Someone had tucked it there decades ago. He unfolded it carefully. It was a newspaper clipping. The date read, October 17th, 1958. The headline was small. Local schoolboy missing on Western Moor. Hamish read every word. 10-year-old Ian McKinnon had vanished while searching for a stray lamb. Despite days of searching, neither the boy nor any trace of him had ever been found. His surname caught Hamish's attention immediately. Mackinnon, the same family Donald MacLean had mentioned. He read the clipping again. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, appeared a single sentence. Search parties were assisted by estate manager Malcolm Fraser, who stated that the child could not have wandered far from Keelik's Hollow. Hamish's eyes narrowed. If the Hollow had already been known by that name in 1958, why had everyone in Lockdown now forgotten it? More importantly, why had the estate manager known exactly where to search? As evening settled over the village, Hamish walked slowly back toward the police station. The wind carried the scent of wet heather and peat smoke. Lugs trotted ahead before suddenly stopping outside the old public telephone box near the harbour. The dog sniffed the ground intently. Hamish followed. Half hidden beneath the bench lay a crumpled envelope, damp from the rain. There was no stamp, no address. Only one word had been written across the front in hurried block letters. Macbeth. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message contained only one sentence. "Stop digging into the past, or the Moor will claim another policeman." Hamish read it twice. There was no signature, no fingerprints visible to the naked eye, just those 11 words, written by someone who clearly knew he would be asking questions no one in Lockdown wanted answered. He folded the note neatly, slipped it into his pocket, and looked toward the darkening line of the western moor. Someone had gone to the trouble of warning him, which meant someone was afraid. And frightened people, Hamish knew from long experience, were far more dangerous than angry ones. The anonymous note remained in Hamish's pocket throughout the evening. He mentioned it to no one, not even Blair. There were 2 reasons for that. The first was practical. Blair would dismiss it as a childish prank before demanding 3 unnecessary reports. The second was instinct. Whoever had left the message had wanted it to reach Hamish alone. Until he understood why, he preferred to keep that advantage. Lugs stretched out before the stove, while Hamish warmed a pot of stew left over from the previous night. Outside, rain pattered softly against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness the harbour bell clanged as the tide shifted. He unfolded the note once more. The handwriting was carefully disguised, every letter printed in stiff block capitals. But disguises were rarely perfect. Whoever had written it pressed unusually hard on downward strokes, leaving faint grooves in the paper. The sheet itself was ordinary enough, torn from a ruled writing pad, sold in any village shop, nothing remarkable. Which, Hamish thought, was often the most remarkable thing of all. Someone had taken pains not to stand out. The following morning began with the arrival of a television van. Hamish groaned quietly as he watched it pull into the square. "That's all we need." Lugs merely yawned. A young reporter stepped out, her neat coat already losing its battle with the Highland drizzle. A cameraman followed, carrying equipment that looked entirely unsuited to muddy roads. The reporter spotted Hamish immediately. "Constable Macbeth. So I've heard. I'm Fiona Ross, from Scottish television. I'm sorry to hear it." She smiled politely, uncertain whether he was joking. "We'd like a statement regarding the skeleton." "There isn't one." "No statement. No skeleton either." She blinked. "There most certainly is. Not here." She looked momentarily confused before laughing. "I've heard about your sense of humor." "I haven't. Could we interview you?" "I wouldn't recommend it." "Why not?" "I'm poor company before lunch." She persisted. "Is it true the remains may belong to a murder victim?" "I don't know." "Do you suspect foul play?" "I usually do." "Can you tell us anything?" Hamish considered. "The weather's improving." The cameraman lowered his equipment in defeat. Mrs. McLean, watching from the hotel doorway, chuckled into her apron. By the time the television crew gave up, they had acquired exactly 30 seconds of footage showing Hamish scratching Lugs behind the ears while refusing to answer questions. "A masterpiece," Mrs. McLean declared. "I try." Blair arrived shortly afterward, in a mood that suggested the television interview had already reached Strathbane. "You made us look ridiculous. I've always thought you managed that yourself." Blair's eyes bulged. "What did you say?" "I said the weather was improving. You deliberately avoided answering questions." "I wasn't obliged to answer them. You represent the police." "I was representing silence." Blair pointed toward the hotel. "Inside, now." The lounge was empty except for Pembroke, who sat reading financial papers with obvious irritation. Blair shut the door. "We've had confirmation from the archaeologists." Hamish waited. "The skeleton is approximately 120 years old. So Victorian. Late Victorian. Cause of death: severe blow to the skull. Murder?" Blair hesitated. "They can't rule it out." Pembroke slammed his newspaper onto the table. "This is absurd." Neither policeman looked at him. "I've paid a fortune for that estate." Blair sighed impatiently. Yes. I demand permission to continue work." "You'll have it." "When?" "As soon as the archaeologists finish." Pembroke leaned forward. "I've investors arriving next week." Hamish finally spoke. "Why such a hurry?" Pembroke frowned. "Business. Luxury lodges can wait a fortnight. Not these. Why? Pembroke's answer came a fraction too quickly. Contracts. Hamish noticed. Blair did not. Later that afternoon, Hamish walked to the village shop. Officially, he needed tobacco. Unofficially, village shops were better than interrogation rooms. People forgot themselves while discussing groceries. Inside, Mrs. Patel greeted him warmly. "Good afternoon, Constable." "Afternoon. You'll be wanting your usual." "Aye." As she reached for the tobacco, another customer entered. It was Simon, the young surveyor from Pembroke's team. He looked tired. Dark circles had formed beneath his eyes. Mrs. Patel disappeared into the storeroom, leaving the two men alone. Hamish spoke casually. "Still working the moor?" Simon nodded. "For now. You don't sound happy." "I didn't sleep." "The skeleton." Simon glanced toward the window. "It isn't just that." Hamish waited. The younger man lowered his voice. "I didn't mention everything." "No?" "The day before we found the grave." "Go on." "I saw someone up there." "Where?" "Near the ridge." "What time?" "Just after sunset." "What were they doing?" "I couldn't tell." "Man or woman?" "A man." "Local?" "I don't know." Simon rubbed the back of his neck. "He was carrying a lantern." "A lantern?" "Not a torch." Hamish frowned. "In this day and age? I thought it odd." "What happened?" "He disappeared." "Into the mist." Simon nodded. "I followed." "And?" "There was nobody there." Mrs. Patel returned carrying a paper bag. Simon immediately fell silent. Hamish thanked her, paid for his tobacco, and wandered out into the square. A lantern. Not an electric torch. Someone deliberately avoiding bright light. Someone visiting the ridge before the excavation. That evening, Hamish called on Elspeth Grant. The journalist was sorting notebooks across her dining table when she opened the door. "You've come to steal information." "I was hoping for tea first." "You've become shameless." "I've always been shameless." She smiled and waved him inside. The kettle was already boiling. "You've been thinking," she said, placing 2 mugs on the table. "I usually try. About Pembroke, among other things." She studied him carefully. "You're bothered?" "A little. Because of the skeleton?" "No." She looked surprised. "Then what?" "Him." She nodded slowly. "I noticed something yesterday." "What?" "When Blair was shouting." "He usually is." "Pembroke wasn't looking at Blair." "No?" "He kept watching the excavation." Hamish looked up. Not angrily. "No?" Nervously. Elspeth stirred her tea. It wasn't the expression of a man annoyed by delays. What was it? The expression of someone wondering whether something else might be found. The room fell quiet. Hamish replayed the scene in his mind. She was right. While Blair had blustered and complained, Pembroke had scarcely taken his eyes off the trench, almost as though the skeleton itself had been less alarming than whatever might still lie beneath it. Darkness had settled by the time Hamish left Elspeth's cottage. The village streets were empty. Only the wind moved through the narrow lanes. As he crossed the bridge toward the police station, he noticed movement near the harbour. A solitary figure stood beside Pembroke's black Range Rover. The person wore a dark coat with the collar turned high. Hamish instinctively stepped into the shadow of the bridge. The figure glanced around cautiously, before slipping something beneath the driver's seat through the half-open window. Not stealing, placing. Within seconds, the stranger melted into the darkness between the cottages. Hamish hurried forward, but by the time he reached the vehicle, whoever it was had vanished without a sound. He looked around. Nothing, only the sea whispering against the pier. The driver's door was unlocked. Hamish hesitated only briefly before opening it. He crouched and reached beneath the seat. His fingers touched cold metal. He drew out a small, mud-stained tin box, no larger than a cigar case. There was no lock, only a rusted clasp. Hamish eased it open. Inside lay a yellowed photograph. 5 people stood outside a crofter's cottage. A man, a woman, 2 young girls, and a boy of about 10. Written neatly on the back, in faded ink, were 4 words: "The Mackinnons, summer 1957. Tucked behind the photograph was a second item, a folded page torn from a diary. Most of the writing had faded beyond recognition. Only one sentence remained legible. "If Malcolm learns where father buried it, none of us will live to see winter." Hamish stared at the words for several long seconds. The estate manager named in the old newspaper clipping had been Malcolm Fraser. And someone, somewhere, wanted Hamish to find this box before Pembroke did. Hamish closed the tin box without another glance at its contents. and slipped it beneath his waterproof jacket. He took one last look around the harbor. Nothing. The cottages were dark except for the occasional glow of a lamp behind drawn curtains. The sea sighed gently against the pilings, and the only movement came from a gull balancing on a mooring post. Whoever had hidden the box beneath Pembroke's vehicle had vanished with remarkable speed. That, Hamish thought, suggested practice. He resisted the temptation to examine the diary page under the nearest street lamp. There would be time for that later, somewhere warm, with coffee. Luggs sniffed around the Range Rover, circled it once, then suddenly became interested in the rear tire. Hamish crouched beside him. Fresh mud, not unusual, except this mud was darker than the peat on the western moor, and mixed with tiny fragments of pale gravel. Hamish rubbed a little between his fingers. It had come from somewhere else. Pembroke had driven somewhere since arriving in Lochdoe, somewhere he had neglected to mention. By the following morning, Blair had transformed the police station into what he imagined was the headquarters of a major murder inquiry. Maps covered the walls. Files littered the desk. 3 detectives from Strathbane stood looking extremely busy, while accomplishing almost nothing. Blair pointed dramatically at the western moor. "I want every person connected with that estate interviewed." "Yes, sir," one detective replied. "The contractors." "Yes, sir." "The surveyors." "Yes, sir." "The gardener." "There isn't one, sir." "Then find one." Hamish quietly poured himself a mug of coffee. Blair rounded on him. "And you?" "I? Stop wandering about." "I wasn't wandering." "What were you doing?" "Making coffee." "You'll assist Detective Sergeant Forbes." Hamish glanced toward the young detective, who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. "Certainly." Blair looked suspicious. "You agreed too quickly. I've surprised myself." Detective Sergeant Forbes turned out to be considerably more pleasant than his superior. As they drove toward Muir House, he spoke in a confidential tone. "I've always wanted to ask you something." "Go on." "Is it true you solve cases by listening to gossip?" "Sometimes." "Does it work?" "Better than shouting." Forbes smiled. "I wish someone would tell Blair that." They spent the morning interviewing workmen. Most had little to contribute beyond complaints about weather and delays. Then they found George Wilkie, an elderly excavator operator. George removed his cap respectfully. "I've already told the inspector everything." "Tell me again," Hamish said. George shrugged. "If you like." "You were first to notice the bones?" "Aye." "What exactly happened?" "I was stripping peat. Then my machine struck something hard." "The skeleton?" "No." Hamish became still. "What did it strike?" "A wooden box." Forbes looked up sharply. "What box?" George frowned. "I thought you'd know." "No." George scratched his beard. "It wasn't large." "What happened to it?" "Mr. Pembroke climbed into the trench before anyone else." Hamish exchanged a glance with Forbes. George continued. "He picked it up, and he said it contained nothing but rotten wood." "What did he do with it?" George thought for a moment. "He carried it away himself." Hamish's coffee-colored eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "You actually saw the box?" "Aye." "Certain?" George looked offended. "I've been driving diggers 40 years. I know the difference between a box and a sheep." "What size?" "About this long." He measured roughly 18 inches with his hands. "Old oak, by the look of it. And nobody else examined it." George shook his head. "Pembroke said it was falling apart." Forbes scribbled rapidly into his notebook. Hamish said nothing. If George was right, Pembroke had removed evidence before the police ever reached the scene. That afternoon, Hamish finally had the opportunity to examine the diary page properly. He sat alone at his kitchen table while Luggs snored peacefully nearby. The faded paper was fragile. Most of the ink had vanished. Holding it beneath a bright lamp revealed faint impressions where the writer's pen had pressed deeply into the page. Hamish tilted the sheet sideways. Several nearly invisible words emerged. "The silver," lower down, "grave," and finally, "Fraser must never." The rest had disappeared forever. Silver, grave, Fraser, 3 fragments. Not enough to tell a story. Enough to suggest one. His eyes moved to the old photograph. The Mackinnon family looked ordinary, hard-working, respectable. The father stood stiffly in work clothes. His wife smiled faintly. The 2 daughters appeared embarrassed by the camera. Only the young boy grinned openly. On the reverse, someone had written, "The Mackinnons. Summer 1957. Yet the newspaper clipping from the archives had stated that Ian Mackinnon disappeared in October 1958. The photograph had been taken barely a year before. Hamish looked closer. Something caught his attention. Behind the family stood another man, only half visible at the edge of the frame. Most of his face had been accidentally cropped away, but one feature remained unmistakable. He walked to the bookshelf, retrieved the newspaper clipping, and compared it carefully. The photograph accompanying the article showed estate manager Malcolm Fraser standing outside Moor House. Same heavy shoulders, same distinctive flat cap. The man in the family photograph was Malcolm Fraser. Why would an estate manager appear in a cheerful family portrait? They looked comfortable together, almost friendly. That did not fit the fearful sentence from the diary. A knock sounded at the door. It was Elspeth. "I thought I'd find you hiding. I was working." "You call that work?" "Occasionally." She noticed the photograph. "Found something? Perhaps?" He handed it to her. She studied it quietly. "I know that face." "So do I." "No." She shook her head. "I mean recently." Hamish looked up. "Recently? I've seen someone who looks exactly like him." "Impossible. I know he's dead." "Where?" She frowned in concentration. "At Pembroke's house." Hamish stared. "He has a portrait hanging in the entrance hall." "What?" "A large oil painting." "Of Malcolm Fraser?" "I didn't know who it was." She pointed to the cropped figure. "But I'm certain it's the same man." Hamish felt the pieces shift ever so slightly. Pembroke had purchased Moor House only weeks earlier. Yet he had chosen to hang a portrait of the estate manager instead of removing it with the previous owner's belongings. Why? Most new owners redecorated. Pembroke had preserved the portrait, deliberately. That evening Hamish returned alone to Moor House. The front gate stood open. Lights glowed in only 2 downstairs windows. Pembroke's expensive Range Rover remained parked outside. Hamish knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Silence. As he turned to leave, movement caught his eye through the side window. Someone carrying a lantern. Not an electric torch, a proper hurricane lamp. The figure disappeared into the cellar staircase beneath the house. Hamish quietly crossed the lawn. The cellar door stood slightly ajar. A narrow ribbon of yellow light escaped through the gap. He descended the damp stone steps without making a sound. Voices drifted upward. One belonged unmistakably to Pembroke. The other was lower, older, local. Hamish stopped just short of the doorway. "I paid you enough," Pembroke was saying sharply. The older man replied in a voice almost too quiet to hear. "You paid to buy the estate." A pause. "You never bought what lies beneath it." Hamish leaned closer. Pembroke answered through clenched teeth. "Then tell me where the rest is." The old man laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed around the stone cellar. "You've already dug up 1 grave." Another silence. Then came 7 words that made Hamish's pulse quicken. "The treasure was never buried with the body." Hamish remained motionless in the darkness outside the cellar door. The old stone walls carried every word with surprising clarity. Lugs, pressed against his leg, neither growled nor whined. The dog seemed to understand that silence mattered. Inside, Pembroke spoke first. "You've lied to me from the beginning." "I've survived by lying," the older man replied evenly. "There's a difference. You told me the Mackinnons buried it on the ridge. I told you people believed they did. You took my money." "I did." A chair scraped across the flagstones. Hamish risked the smallest glance through the narrow gap. Pembroke stood with his back to the door, his expensive coat thrown over a chair. Opposite him sat a heavily built man in his late 70s, his weathered face lined by wind and years rather than comfort. Thick white hair curled beneath a tweed cap resting on the table. Hamish recognized him at once. Callum Fraser, Malcolm Fraser's youngest brother. He lived quietly on a croft several miles north of Lochdu, and seldom came into the village. Hamish had not seen him in weeks. "You've wasted enough of my time," Pembroke said. Callum smiled faintly. "No. You've wasted your own." "What is that supposed to mean?" "You came looking for silver." Pembroke's expression hardened. "I came looking for what your brother stole." At the mention of Malcolm's name, the old man's eyes darkened. "My brother stole many things. So you admit it." "I admit nothing to the likes of you." Pembroke leaned both hands on the table. "The diary mentioned silver." "Huh. So it did. The Mackinnons hid it." "Perhaps. The grave proves it." Callum shook his head slowly. "The grave proves only that one poor soul never went home." Hamish felt a flicker of satisfaction. The old man was revealing just enough to keep Pembroke talking. The same trick Hamish often used himself. The conversation ended abruptly when headlights swept across the cellar window. Pembroke straightened. "Who's that?" Callum listened. "A vehicle." Pembroke strode toward the stairs. Hamish slipped silently back into the darkness outside, flattening himself against the damp stone wall. A police Land Rover pulled into the courtyard. Blair climbed out, looking irritated even before he reached the front door. Hamish could almost hear the complaints forming. Pembroke hurried out to meet him. "What are you doing here?" Blair puffed himself up importantly. "Routine inquiries. You've chosen a ridiculous hour." "I choose my own hours." The two men disappeared into the house, already arguing. Callum remained below. Hamish waited another minute before quietly tapping on the cellar door. The old man looked up without surprise. "I wondered how long you'd stand listening." Hamish smiled. "I've been told I'm patient." "I." Callum poured tea from a battered flask into a chipped enamel mug. "You'll have one? I've never refused tea. You'll start now if you taste this." Hamish accepted it anyway. It was dreadful. "You knew I was there," Hamish said. "I heard your dog breathing." "Lugs has never mastered stealth." Callum scratched the dog's ears. "Good beast." They sat in silence for a while. Finally Hamish produced the old photograph. "I found this." Callum looked at it for a long time, his expression softened. "I'd forgotten that day. You knew the Mackinnons well. They were family, after a fashion. You were in the picture. I took it." Hamish turned the photograph over. "The handwriting, my wife's. She wrote the names." Callum nodded. "She liked photographs. What happened to the Mackinnons?" The old man's eyes settled on the lantern. "They trusted the wrong man." "Malcolm?" "No." "Who?" Callum looked directly at Hamish. "My brother wasn't the worst of them." Hamish let the silence stretch. People often hurried to fill silence. Callum eventually did. "My brother managed the estate. I know. He was greedy. I'd gathered that. But he wasn't clever." "Who was?" "The owner." Hamish frowned. "The laird?" Callum nodded. "Angus Strathmore." The name stirred a distant memory. The Strathmore family had owned Moor House before selling it decades earlier. They discovered something after the war. Callum continued. "What?" "Old church silver." Hamish remained quiet. "Hidden during the Reformation. So the stories were true." "Oh yes." "Where?" Callum smiled sadly. "If I knew that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You said the Mackinnons found it. I said they found something. Enough for people to kill." The old man stared into his mug. "Enough." A heavy knock echoed from above. Both men looked toward the cellar ceiling. Blair's unmistakable voice thundered through the house. "Pembroke, open this blasted door." Callum chuckled. "He's a loud one. He saves time by shouting." "You work for him?" "Only on paper." The old man laughed outright. Then his face grew serious. "Macbeth." "Aye?" "The skeleton on the moor. What about it?" "It isn't Ian Mackinnon. I didn't think it was. It isn't his father either." Hamish's pulse quickened. "You know who it is?" Callum nodded once. "I've always known." "Tell me." Before the old man could answer, another sound drifted from outside. Not Blair. Not Pembroke. A sharp crack. Glass shattering. Then Luggs sprang to his feet with a fierce bark. Hamish spun toward the cellar steps. A second crack followed. This time unmistakably a gunshot. They burst into the courtyard together. Blair was crouching behind his Land Rover, red-faced and shouting contradictory orders at two bewildered detectives. Pembroke had disappeared. One of the front windows had exploded inward, scattering broken glass across the entrance hall. "Where?" Blair yelled. "Who fired?" Nobody answered. The echo rolled away across the hills. Hamish's eyes swept the darkness. The shot had come from higher ground, near the edge of the woods overlooking the house. Without waiting for permission, he started running. "Macbeth!" Blair roared behind him. Hamish ignored him. Luggs raced ahead, climbing the steep slope with surprising speed. The woodland swallowed them. Branches whipped against Hamish's face. Loose stones shifted beneath his boots. Then Luggs barked again. Hamish reached a small clearing. Empty. The shooter had gone. Only one thing remained. A rifle. It lay abandoned against a fallen pine, as though dropped in haste. Hamish approached carefully. The weapon was old but well maintained. Recently fired. He opened the bolt. One spent cartridge. One unfired round. Whoever had used it had intended a second shot. His gaze moved to the ground. The earth was soft from days of rain. Fresh footprints led away through the trees. One set. Large boots. The left sole carried a distinctive triangular cut near the heel. Hamish memorized it automatically. Then he noticed something else. Half hidden beneath a fern lay a folded sheet of paper, weighted down by a stone. It had not fallen accidentally. It had been left deliberately. For him. He unfolded it. This note contained only 6 handwritten words. "Ask Blair about Malcolm Fraser's death." Hamish read the sentence twice. Malcolm Fraser had officially died of a heart attack nearly 30 years earlier. At least, that was what everyone believed. Yet someone now wanted Hamish to question the one man in Scotland least likely to answer honestly. And for the first time since the skeleton had been unearthed, Hamish began to suspect that the mystery on the moor was not merely about a forgotten Victorian murder. It was also about a crime that had been successfully buried within living memory. The note crackled softly in Hamish's hand as the wind stirred through the pines. He folded it once, slipped it into his pocket beside the earlier anonymous warning, and looked again at the abandoned rifle. Lugs was circling a clump of bracken several yards away. The dog gave a short bark. "What is it?" Lugs lowered his nose and followed a scent downhill before stopping beside a narrow burn that cut across the hillside. The water had washed away most of the footprints. Most, but not all. Hamish crouched. The shooter had crossed the stream in haste, slipping slightly on the wet stones. One heel had dug deeply into the muddy bank before climbing toward the old shepherd's track leading north. The triangular cut in the left boot heel had left another perfect impression. He smiled faintly. Careless. By the time Blair and two detectives puffed into the clearing, Hamish was standing quietly beside the rifle. Blair pointed dramatically. "There." One detective reached for the weapon. "Don't touch it," Hamish said. Blair rounded on him. "I'll decide who touches it." "Very good." The detective wisely withdrew his hand. Blair glared at Hamish. "Did you see anyone?" "No." "Hear anything?" "A rifle." "I know it was a rifle." Hamish nodded sympathetically. "I thought you probably did." Blair's face turned a familiar shade of crimson. "You think this is amusing?" "No. It sounds like it. It often does." Blair bent to inspect the footprints, but immediately managed to plant one polished shoe squarely on the clearest impression. Hamish closed his eyes briefly. "There." Blair looked pleased. "What? You've contaminated the evidence." "I've done no such thing." "You've improved it?" Blair muttered several words unsuitable for polite company. The following morning brought another unwelcome visitor. A dark blue saloon pulled into Lockdow just after 9 o'clock. From it emerged a neatly dressed solicitor, carrying an expensive leather briefcase. He asked immediately for Alistair Pembroke. Mrs. McLean pointed toward Muir House. "He'll be there." The solicitor hesitated. "I understand there has been unpleasantness." Mrs. McLean considered. "That depends on your standards." Hamish happened to be passing. The solicitor introduced himself. "Richard Ames, morning. I represent Mr. Pembroke." "So I gathered." Ames lowered his voice. "My client is becoming increasingly concerned about being shot at." "No." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "The delays. I see. He believes the police investigation is exceeding reasonable limits." Hamish looked thoughtfully across the harbour. "A skeleton usually does." "There has been no crime." "There has been at least one. The remains are over a century old. People don't generally shoot at policemen over archaeology." The solicitor opened his mouth to reply, then closed it again. "I should speak with my client. I expect he'll say the same." Hamish watched the car disappear toward Muir House before turning in the opposite direction. Instead of visiting Pembroke, he walked to the churchyard. Few people noticed. Fewer questioned him. The oldest gravestones occupied the rear corner beneath twisted yew trees. Many inscriptions had weathered away. One name remained perfectly legible. Malcolm Fraser, beloved husband, faithful estate manager, 1930, 1997. Hamish knelt to examine the stone. Nothing unusual, until he noticed fresh flowers. White lilies. They could not have been more than 2 days old. Odd. Donald MacLean had once mentioned Malcolm had no surviving children. His widow had died years earlier. Someone still visited. Someone who wished to remain unnoticed. As Hamish stood, he heard footsteps behind him. It was the minister. "Morning, Hamish. Morning. You've an interest in Malcolm Fraser?" "I've developed one." The minister sighed. "I buried him. So I understand. He died suddenly. Heart attack. That's what the doctor certified." Hamish looked toward the grave. "Were there any questions?" The minister hesitated. "A few." "What sort?" "He was found alone in the old estate office. No witnesses. No. Anyone discover him?" The minister nodded slowly. "His brother, Callum." "Yes." Hamish filed the answer away. "Did Malcolm have enemies?" The minister gave a weary smile. "In the Highlands. I'll take that as yes." That afternoon Hamish finally paid Callum Fraser a visit. The old crofter was splitting firewood behind his cottage. He looked unsurprised. "I wondered when you'd ask." "About Malcolm." Callum drove the axe neatly into another log. "He wasn't always a bad man." "What changed?" "Money." "The silver?" "Perhaps." Callum rested both hands on the axe handle. You've spoken to the minister. I have. He'll have told you Malcolm died of his heart. Yes. Callum looked away toward the hills. My brother feared something long before that. What? He said someone was following him. Hamish remained silent. He stopped sleeping. Did he name anyone? No. He simply became frightened, terrified. Callum wiped his brow. The week before he died, he came here. What did he want? He asked me to hide something. Hamish's attention sharpened. What? Callum disappeared into the cottage. When he returned, he carried an old biscuit tin. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. My brother made me swear never to hand these to anyone. And now? The old man smiled sadly. My brother also said that if honest police ever started asking questions, the truth had waited long enough. He placed the bundle in Hamish's hands. Back at the police station, Hamish brewed a fresh pot of coffee before opening the letters. Most concerned estate business, livestock, boundary disputes, rent collections. Then one envelope caught his eye. It had never been posted. The flap remained unsealed. The handwriting matched the faded diary page found in the tin box. Inside was a single sheet addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Hamish began reading. If anything happens to me, do not believe it was natural. I have made mistakes that cannot be undone. Angus Strathmore discovered the silver beneath Kelly's Hollow years ago, but he did not act alone. Others helped him remove it. One family refused to remain silent. The letter ended there. The lower half had been torn away. Someone had deliberately removed the rest. No signature. But the handwriting matched Malcolm Fraser's entries in old estate records preserved in the parish archive. A confession. Or the beginning of one. Just then the station telephone rang. Hamish answered. Lockdow Police. The voice on the other end was strained. Constable, it's Simon. The young surveyor sounded breathless. Slow down. I've remembered something. What? The night I saw the man with the lantern. Go on. He wasn't alone. Hamish straightened. There was someone else. Yes. I couldn't see them clearly. Man or woman? I don't know. What do you remember? There was a long pause. Then Simon whispered. They were arguing. About what? I only heard one sentence. What sentence? Simon swallowed audibly. The older one shouted. Another pause. You should have left the second grave alone. The line fell silent. Hamish felt a cold certainty settle over him. One skeleton had already been uncovered. If Simon's memory was accurate, there was another grave somewhere on the moor. And whoever had fired the rifle from the hillside had almost certainly been trying to ensure that no one ever found it. The words lingered in Hamish's mind long after he had put down the telephone. You should have left the second grave alone. Not the grave, the second grave. He poured himself another cup of coffee, though he scarcely tasted it. Luggs lifted his head hopefully, mistaking the movement for supper preparations, then settled back onto the rug with a disappointed sigh. Hamish spread everything across the kitchen table. The old parish map, the newspaper clipping about Ian Mackinnon, the anonymous warnings, the faded photograph. Malcolm Fraser's unfinished letter, the diary fragment. He stared at them for several minutes without trying to force an answer. People made mistakes when they hurried. Eventually his eyes returned to the map. Kelly's Hollow. The excavation sat almost in the middle of the marked hollow. Almost. Not exactly. The old cartographer had drawn two small circles, joined by a dotted path. Pembroke's workmen had dug beside the first. The second circle lay nearly 50 yards farther west, hidden beneath a patch of dense gorse. Hamish smiled to himself. So, Luggs opened one eye. I think we've been looking in the wrong place. He decided against informing Blair. There seemed little point. Blair would arrive with half the force from Strathburn, trample every inch of the hillside, and announce to the newspapers that he had solved everything before anyone had lifted a spade. Instead, Hamish called only one person. Elspeth Grant answered on the second ring. You sound pleased. I've found something. You always say that. This time I might be right. When? Now. I'll bring sandwiches. Excellent. By late afternoon, the two of them stood at the western edge of Kelly's Hollow. A light breeze bent the heather into slow purple waves. Cloud shadows drifted over the hills, darkening one slope before brightening another. No surveyors remained. Blair had ordered all work suspended after the shooting. Only silence occupied the moor. Elspeth unfolded the old map. I see it. The second circle? She nodded. It isn't where they've been digging. No. You think whoever drew this meant two separate sites? I think people rarely add things to maps for decoration. Luggs wandered toward the gorse bushes. Then he stopped. His ears pricked. Without barking, He began scratching energetically at the peat. Hamish exchanged a glance with Elspeth. Good dog. Using only their hands at first, they cleared away loose heather and moss. Within minutes, Hamish's fingers struck something hard. Not bone, stone. He brushed away more peat. A flat slab emerged. Unlike the surrounding ground, it had been deliberately placed. Near one edge, a rusted iron ring protruded from beneath the moss. Elspeth stared. That isn't a gravestone. No, what is it? Hamish gripped the ring and pulled. Nothing happened. Heavy. Together they strained. The slab shifted with a grinding sound before sliding several inches aside. Cold air rose from the darkness beneath. Not a grave. A narrow stone shaft. Elspeth looked down. I can't see the bottom. Hamish struck a match. The tiny flame illuminated rough stone steps disappearing into darkness. A passage. On the moor? Aye. Lugs whined softly. Hamish lit his lantern. I'll go first. I expected you would. The passage descended perhaps 20 feet before leveling out. The walls had been cut from solid rock centuries earlier. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. The air smelled of damp earth and old stone. Elspeth followed close behind. This place is ancient. Aye. Smugglers? Hamish shook his head. No sea nearby. They continued cautiously. The tunnel widened unexpectedly into a small chamber. The lantern light revealed shelves carved directly into the rock. Most stood empty. Dust coated everything. Then Elspeth gasped. Against the far wall rested 3 oak chests. Their lids hung open. Inside, nothing. Only scraps of rotted cloth. Hamish examined one carefully. The silver. You think this is where it was hidden? I do. But it's gone. A long time gone. He noticed grooves in the stone floor, deep scratches leading toward the tunnel entrance. Heavy loads. They dragged the chests out. Exactly. On the wall above the shelves, someone had carved initials. As Elspeth looked at Hamish. Angus Strathmore. So it would seem. He smiled faintly. Malcolm wasn't lying. A faint sound echoed through the tunnel. Not dripping water. Footsteps. Someone else was inside. Hamish extinguished the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed them. The footsteps paused, then resumed. Slow. Careful. Approaching. Hamish placed one hand gently on Elspeth's shoulder, silently urging her to remain still. The unseen visitor carried a lantern. Its glow gradually appeared around the bend in the passage. One figure, broad-shouldered, walking with a slight limp. The lantern illuminated the face. Callum Fraser. The old man stopped abruptly. You may as well light yours, he said calmly. Hamish relit the lantern. You knew about this place. Callum nodded. My father showed it to me. You never mentioned it. You never asked. Hamish looked at the empty chests. The silver was here, for centuries. And Strathmore took it. Most of it. Hamish's head came up. Most. Callum smiled sadly. The laird believed he'd found everything. He hadn't. My brother discovered another hiding place. The second grave. Callum's expression changed. No. He spoke so firmly that Hamish immediately abandoned the idea. The second grave has nothing to do with treasure. What then? Callum lowered the lantern. It holds the only man who knew who killed the first. Silence filled the chamber. Elspeth stared. The first skeleton was murdered to keep the silver secret, Callum finished. And the second? The old man's weathered face tightened. The second man was murdered 80 years later. Hamish felt the pieces fall together. Not one crime. 2, separated by generations, connected by the same secret. Before anyone could speak again, a muffled explosion echoed from above. The ground trembled. Dust showered from the ceiling. Lugs barked furiously. Another rumble followed. Hamish looked toward the tunnel entrance. That came from outside. Callum's face drained of color. They've found us. Who? But the old man was already hurrying toward the steps. They emerged onto the moor to find smoke rising from the direction of Muir House. A dark column climbed into the evening sky. Flames licked through the roof. People were already running across the fields from Lochdu. Hamish stared for only a heartbeat before breaking into a run. As he raced downhill, one dreadful thought took shape. The fire had not started by accident. Someone was destroying something. Or someone. And if Pembroke was still inside the burning house, then the man who had come to Lochdu searching for a forgotten secret might have become the newest victim of it. The fire had taken hold of Muir House with frightening speed. Dry timber hidden beneath old stone crackled like musket fire. As flames burst through the upper windows, villagers formed an uneven bucket line from a nearby pond, while others shouted for blankets, ladders, and anything that might help. The fire brigade from Strathbane was still many miles away. Hamish ran straight for the front door. Blair was already there, red-faced with exertion rather than anger for once. Macbeth, anyone inside? Pembroke, and we can't find him. Hamish looked up. One upstairs window stood open. A curtain fluttered outward through thick black smoke. Without another word, he wrapped his jacket around his mouth and disappeared into the house. Macbeth, Blair shouted after him. But Hamish was already gone. Inside, the smoke was almost blinding. Heat rolled through the entrance hall in suffocating waves. Lugs stayed close behind, nose low to the floor. The staircase groaned ominously. "Hullo!" Hamish shouted. No answer, only the roar of the fire. Then, a faint cough. Upstairs. Hamish climbed quickly, keeping close to the wall as burning embers drifted down from the ceiling. He reached the landing just as a door burst open. Pembroke stumbled into the corridor, soot-blackened and barely able to stand. "The study," he gasped. Hamish caught his arm. "Can you walk?" "My papers." "Forget the papers. They're worth. So's your life." Pembroke hesitated for only a second before nodding. Together they made their way downstairs. The front hallway was already filling with flames. Hamish kicked open a side door leading to the garden. They burst into the cool evening air, just as part of the roof collapsed behind them, with a deafening crash. Villagers cheered in relief. Blair hurried over. "I was just about to organize a rescue." Hamish looked at the blazing house. "So I noticed." Once Pembroke had been wrapped in blankets and examined by the local doctor. Hamish wandered quietly toward the ruins of the old stable. Callum Fraser was waiting there. "I knew you'd come. You started the fire." The old man looked offended. "No. You know who did." Callum nodded. "I've known for years. Then it's time." Callum watched sparks drift into the darkening sky. "My brother Malcolm wasn't murdered because of treasure. I've begun to suspect that. He died because he finally decided to tell the truth. The letter. He never finished it." "No. Who stopped him?" Callum closed his eyes. "Angus Strathmore's son." Hamish frowned. "Robert Strathmore. He inherited the estate. He died years ago. So everyone believes." Hamish said nothing. Callum continued. "He changed his name." A quiet voice interrupted them. "You've worked it out, haven't you?" Both men turned. Alistair Pembroke stood only a few yards away. His blanket had slipped from one shoulder. His face was streaked with soot, but his eyes were calm. Too calm. Hamish looked at him steadily. "You're Robert Strathmore." Pembroke gave a tired smile. "My father's surname carried rather too much history. So you became Pembroke. It opened more doors. You bought your own childhood home to finish what my father began." Callum's voice trembled. "You never gave up." Pembroke ignored him. "My father found most of the church silver. He murdered for it. He protected his family. He killed an innocent man." Pembroke's smile vanished. "The crofter discovered the silver before father could remove it. The skeleton. He threatened to expose everything. So your father killed him." Pembroke looked toward the burning house. He panicked. "And Malcolm Fraser, he wasn't meant to die." Callum laughed bitterly. "My brother trusted you." "No." Pembroke shook his head. "He blackmailed my father for years. But eventually, he wanted to confess." Hamish finished the sentence. "So you killed him." Pembroke was silent. Silence was answer enough. Blair arrived, panting heavily. "What's going on?" Hamish glanced at him. "Mr. Pembroke has something to tell us." Pembroke looked from Blair to Hamish. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "A remarkable little village." "No," Hamish replied quietly. "Just one where people remember longer than they admit." Pembroke's shoulders sagged. "My father buried the first body beneath the peat." Callum closed his eyes. "I helped him." Everyone stared at the old man. Tears welled in his eyes. "I was 18. His voice broke. "I thought we were moving a dead man." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know he'd been murdered until years later." Hamish understood at last. Callum had spent 60 years carrying someone else's guilt. "The second grave?" Hamish asked gently. Callum answered. "Malcolm." Blair blinked. "What?" "My brother never reached the cemetery." Pembroke nodded. "He confronted me after father's death. You killed him." "I struck him." He looked genuinely broken now. "He fell, and then I buried him where no one would ever think to look. The second circle." Pembroke lowered his head. "I intended to move him. You never did. There was always another excuse. The fire brigade finally arrived. But by then Muir House was beyond saving. Firefighters concentrated on stopping the flames spreading to nearby woodland. As dawn approached, archaeologists carefully reopened the western side of Kellark's Hollow, exactly where the second circle appeared on the old map. By mid-morning, they found the second grave. The remains were modern enough to identify through clothing, dental records, and personal effects. They belonged to Malcolm Fraser. His death certificate would have to be rewritten. So would 30 years of Highland history. 2 days later, Blair held a triumphant press conference outside the police station. He stood before microphones looking immensely satisfied. Our thorough investigation uncovered inconsistencies in historical records, ultimately leading to the confession of Mr. Alistair Pembroke. One reporter asked, "How did you identify him?" Blair cleared his throat importantly. Experienced detective work. Hamish, standing near the back with lugs, quietly sipped his coffee. Elspeth leaned over. "You could correct him." "I could. You won't." Hamish smiled. "What would happen?" "You'd get promoted." "Exactly." She laughed. "You impossible man." Blair continued describing his own brilliance, while Hamish slowly wandered away before anyone remembered to thank him. A week later, Lochdu had settled back into its familiar rhythm. The television vans had departed. The archaeologists had packed away their equipment. The newspapers moved on to fresher scandals. Only the blackened shell of Muir House remained as a reminder that some secrets demanded a terrible price. Mrs. McLean placed a generous bowl of stew before Hamish. "You've earned it. I was hoping you'd think so." She poured fresh coffee. The superintendent telephoned. Hamish looked up cautiously. "Oh?" "He says Blair's recommendation has gone through." Hamish nearly dropped his spoon. "What recommendation?" "For outstanding leadership during the investigation." Hamish stared in horror. Mrs. McLean could not keep a straight face. Then she burst into laughter. "So much for your peaceful life." Before Hamish could answer, the telephone behind the hotel desk rang. Mrs. McLean listened for a moment before smiling mischievously. "It's Blair." Hamish sighed. "What now?" She covered the receiver. "He says there was an administrative error." Hamish looked hopeful. "He wants to apologize." She laughed even harder. "No." "Then what?" "He accidentally recommended himself." Hamish leaned back with immense relief. "There now." Mrs. McLean handed him another mug of coffee. "I've never seen anyone so pleased to be overlooked." Hamish looked through the window, toward the quiet harbor. Fishing boats rocked gently with the tide. The mountains stood blue beneath drifting clouds. Lugs dozed contentedly by the fire. Lochdu was peaceful once more. Exactly as it ought to be. Hamish lifted his coffee in a private toast to ordinary days, unanswered telephones, and the comforting certainty that, with any luck at all, someone else could have the next promotion.